Morning, everybody. Again, it's my privilege to stand before you in Brian's absence. I'm happy to do that. And opportunities like this come along once in a while, and I always enjoy the preparation and so on. Thank you, everybody, for being here. If you got one of the handouts, this morning I want to talk about the progression of sin. And you might wonder, what's this second sheet about Herod? What's that? What's that got to? Well, that's something different. If we have time, the Bible guys, I want to talk about the Herod family and try to look at this chart. And many times the Bible just calls the person Herod when there are a lot of different people involved in the Herod family. And we'll talk about that if we have time in Bible class in a little bit. But the progression of sin, I want to look at 4 examples out of the Old Testament and see how one sin led to another and led to another, and it just got worse and worse. The first is in Genesis chapter 4. I want to look at Cain. And most of these, I'm not going to read the whole account because most of us know these accounts anyway. But in this, on the chart, you see different things that Cain did, different sins that Cain was involved in, and his situation just got worse and worse. To set the stage for this account. Let's start in verse 3 of Genesis 4. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. We remember this story. Cain and Abel. Cain was a tiller of the ground, we're told. He was a farmer. Abel was a keeper of sheep. But they both made an offering to God. It says Abel's was respected or accepted, but Cain's was not. Well, how did that come about? Let's go back to, in the New Testament, to the book of Hebrews a minute. Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 4 says, by faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he, being dead, still speaks. So, it says Abel did something here by faith. And we're told in Romans 10, verse 17, that faith comes from hearing the word of God. It's in different forms. Back in those days, it was spoken. God spoke to people. Today, we obtain our faith through the written word. But back then, God told, it says by faith, I believe he told Cain and Abel what to offer. Abel complied. Cain did not. And as we read there back in Genesis 4, he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. Drop down to verse 8. Now Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So we have the various things that Cain did here on the outline. First, he disobeyed. He didn't do what God said. Then when his brother's offering was accepted and his was not, he became envious. Envious to the point that he hated his brother. Hated his brother to the point that he killed him, the first murder here in Genesis 4. Then that was bad enough, but God talks to him afterwards. Verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? So Cain lied about what he had done. Said he didn't know where Abel was. Well, we all know that he did know where Abel was. So it seemed like one sin compounded the problem and another sin was added. Now let's go over and read a verse in Isaiah chapter 30. Isaiah chapter 30. The first verse. Woe to the rebellious children, says the Lord, who take counsel but not of me, who devise plans but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin. That's exactly what Cain did. He added sin to sin and made his situation worse. So that's one example. Let's go now to Genesis 37 and look at the brothers of Joseph. Genesis 37. We all remember the story of Joseph and how Jacob favored Joseph and Benjamin to a certain degree. But there were certain things that happened. Let's look at verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and indeed your sheaf stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brother said to him, shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. We all remember this story about Joseph and his brothers and the dreams about the sheaves of wheat. The brothers had a pretty good idea what this dream meant, that Joseph would rule over them. And we know it didn't happen immediately. As we read this account here in Genesis 37, they sold him into Egyptian bondage. Joseph went to Egypt as a slave, but Joseph's story changed. He rose in power in Egypt. He was one of the most powerful men in Egypt. And when there became famine in the land of Canaan, his brothers went to Egypt for food. And they go before the officials there in Egypt to ask for food, and lo and behold, who was in charge? Joseph. They didn't recognize him at first, but they did later. But let's look and see what happened here with the brothers. We see in verse 5, Joseph had a dream, and it says, and they hated him even more. Hatred. Let's go over to verse 11. And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And now the real story, so you might say. Verses 31 to 34. After they had sold Joseph and so on, or it happens down in verse 36. So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped his tunic in the blood. And they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? And he recognized it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Joseph tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. So, they took Joseph's coat, dipped it in the blood of an animal they'd killed, then brought it back to their father. And his conclusion was, that's Joseph's coat, that's his tunic. He thought Joseph had been killed by a wild animal of some sort. So there was deception with the brothers to try to fool their father into thinking something that really wasn't true. And they lied about it. Led him to believe that Joseph was dead when they'd actually sold him to the Midianites, who took him on down into Egypt. Again, adding sin to sin that compounds the problem much more. Now let's go over to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 11. And look at King David. David, one of the most popular men ever in Israel. Led them in battle. And under David and Solomon, Israel probably reached its greatest heights as far as wealth and power. And David, even in the New Testament, calls him man after God's own heart. So David was a righteous man. But he did some things that he shouldn't have done. Let's look in this in chapter 11. And it happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful to behold. Let us read a little bit more. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity. And she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, so she sent and told David and said, "I am with child." So David worked himself into a real bad situation here. First of all, he lusted after Bathsheba. He saw her bathing from his rooftop and had his people go and bring her to him. And he committed adultery with Bathsheba. David and Solomon probably set the record for wives. I think Solomon had 700 wives, 300 concubines. David had several wives. And as we're going to look, and we're going to look at the next step example we're looking at, we're going to see at the problems with multiple marriages. God intended man, one woman for life. But when you change that plan, you have trouble. And we see it here with David and with a couple of his sons. We'll get to that in a little bit. So he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and she is with child. David's thinking to himself, now how am I going to handle this? So he plotted to deceive. Verse 6 through 25. That's a long reading, but I think I'll read this passage here, and so we get the whole story. Then David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah had come to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war prospered. David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah departed from the king's house, and the gift of food from the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all his servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. So when they told David, saying Uriah did not go to his house, David said to Uriah, Did you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" And Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants, my lord, are encamped in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. So Uriah refused to do what David asked him to do. David's plan was to get Uriah and his wife together. That would explain her being with child. So he thought. Then in verse 12, then David said to Uriah, wait here today, and tomorrow I will let you depart. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Now when David called him, he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. And at evening he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote it in the letter saying, set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle and retreat from him that he may be struck down and die. So it was while Joab besieged the city that he assigned Uriah to a place where he knew were valiant men. Then the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the people of the servants of David fell, and Uriah the Hittite died also. So Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war, and charged the messengers, saying, when you have finished telling the matters of the war to the king, if it happens that the king's wrath rises, he says to you, why did you approach so near to the city when you fought? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who struck Abimelech, the son of Jerubasheth? Was it not a woman who cast a piece on a millstone from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Why did you go near the wall? Then you will say, thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent by him. And the messenger said to David, surely the men prevailed against us and came out to us in the field. Then we drove them back as far as the entrance of the gate. The archers shot from the wall at your servant, and some of the king's servants are dead. And your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Then David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, let not this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it. So encourage him. Then the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead. She mourned for her husband. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. That last sentence I read. But what David did displeased the Lord. Well, sure did. He conspired to have Uriah killed. Put him in the heat of the battle, the hottest part of the battle. That his death would be pretty sure. So as we look at this list of sins David found himself in, he lusted after Bathsheba, committed adultery with her. There was deception in David's heart to try to explain away why Bathsheba was with child, tried to bring her and Uriah together. He lied about it. Then he made sure Uriah was killed. He murdered Uriah the Hittite. So, adding sin to sin. Now let's go over a page or two to 2 Samuel 13 and look at two of David's sons. One, Amnon. Amnon was David's oldest son. And the other was Absalom. They had different mothers. David was their father, but they had different mothers. Amnon's mother was a lady by the name of Ahinoam. Absalom's mother was Maacah, M-A-A-C-A-H. So let's read about Absalom and Amnon. Verse 1. After this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar. And Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin. And it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimea, David's brother. Now Jonadab was a very crafty man. I'll just stop right there. Amnon lusted after Tamar, his sister, or half-sister, half-sister. One thing led to another. We get down to Amnon pretended to be sick, and he asked David to send Tamar over to his house and feed him. Feed him from her hand, the text says. Let's go down to about verse 10. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food unto the bedroom that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the cakes which she had made and brought them to Amnon her brother in the bedroom. Now when she had brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said, "Come, lie with me, my sister." But she answered him, "No, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing, and where could I take my shame? As for you, you would be like one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." However, he would not heed her voice, and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. So here, Amnon committed incest with his sister. And in that last verse we read, he raped her. Both these things were condemned by the law of Moses. But Amnon could not control his lust for this young lady. Okay, now in verse 15, then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that hate that which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Arise and be gone." So he hated Tamar now. Now, let's drop down to verse 20. This thing kind of festered in Amnon. It says, "And it came to pass after 2 full years." For 2 full years, Amnon had this thing in his mind. After 2 full years, that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. So Absalom invited all the king's sons. Then Absalom came to the king and said, "Kindly note, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." And the king said to Absalom, "No, my son, let us not all go now, lest we be a burden to you." Then he urged him, but he would not go, and he blessed him. Then Absalom said, "If not, let my brother Amnon go with us." So David wouldn't go. So Absalom, how about my brother Amnon? And the king said unto him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him. So he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Now here's the deception. Here's the plan. Verse 28. Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, "Watch now, when Amnon's heart was merry with wine, when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not be afraid, have I not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant." So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, each one got on his mule and fled. This story there are parallels between what I read with this story and with the one with David. David got himself in a situation, and he took care of it by murdering Uriah. Amnon found himself in a situation, and it festered in Absalom's heart for 2 years, but Absalom came up with a way of revenge, you might say. It was a time to shear sheep, so they had this sheep shearing party. That's hard to say. This sheep shearing party out in this certain place. And Amnon got drunk. We read back a little bit ago on that other, where Uriah got drunk. I could talk more about the dangers of drinking, but that's for another time. But deception and murder. Murder. So, these 4 examples, I'm not going to speak real long with this morning, but I think we could see and take the advice of what the Scriptures tell us about sin. In these cases, sin was added to sin. It didn't make things better, it made things worse, and progressively worse. Now, let's go back and reread what Ronnie read for us there a little bit ago, James chapter 1. James chapter 1. Verse 12. Blessed is the man who endures temptation. When he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Here James tells us about the progression of sin. It starts with temptation. Blessed is the man who can endure temptation. And just think how those 4 episodes we read about in the Old Testament, how they could have turned out better if the participants, be it Cain or Joseph's brothers or David or David's son, if they would have endured the temptation, not given in to the temptation and to the lust. Okay, verse 14, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires. King James says lust. And enticed. Then when desire or lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. So James tells us how sin works. How sin works. We can be tempted, and if we give in to that temptation, then as the text says, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, brings forth sin. Sin brings forth death, spiritual death, separation from God. My time's gone. This lesson, it was difficult for me in trying to remember all the details. You had to go back and read and reread and reread again. But how people tried to make sin acceptable, maybe that's not a good word. But how to make sin, how they could overcome sin. Can't do it. We can't do it. The only way we can overcome sin is through the blood of the Lamb. And there may be somebody here this morning who needs to obey the gospel. You've never done that, you haven't put Christ on in baptism. You can do that here this morning. Or there may be someone here who has done that in past days, but you've gone back into your former ways, haven't lived like you should. We can pray for you this morning that the thought of your heart might be forgiven, like Simon the sorcerer back in the book of Acts. So if anyone is subject to the gospel call this morning, please come while we stand, while we sing.